Known as the Dapper Don, John Gotti was a man who walked with swagger. This unique bounce that he had whenever he stepped was the result of one of his toes being amputated. The former boss of the Gambino family began his criminal career as a teenager, and one of his early heists involved stealing a cement mixer from a construction site one night, where it accidentally dropped on his foot and caused his permanent injury. Born on October 27, 1940, John Joseph Gotti Jr. was the fifth of 13 children born to two first-generation Americans in Brooklyn, New York. His father struggled to find steady work to put food on the table, and his younger son, who bore his name, looked down on him with resentment rather than admiration. Instead of honest work, John was drawn to the local neighborhood mafia crew of Gambino Capo Carmine Fatico, who operated out of East New York. The young John Gotti was a juvenile delinquent who wasn't afraid of a fight, and he became noticed by Fatico's men. According to his FBI files that are public, John Gotti first appeared on the Bureau's radar in 1964 when he failed to show up for Army induction after being drafted, and agents were sent to locate him. By then, he was married to his wife, Victoria, and they had two daughters. Plus, John had already racked up 2 arrests and spent time in prison. When they did finally find him, he claimed ignorance of being aware that he had been drafted and that he thought he was exempt from military service due to his criminal record. When the Army took a closer look at him, they agreed that someone like him was not wanted. 21 years later, this petty criminal and mafia associate Wannabe would become the boss of one of the largest criminal organizations in the United States of America. And the only thing more impressive than his rise would be his downfall. Here is how it all happened. John Gotti is believed to have had an IQ of 110, which is considered above average. Despite his obvious intelligence, the man was a high school dropout. He held various odd jobs during his first years in the real world, but his true calling was a life of crime. As a teenager, Gotti formed his own juvenile delinquent street gang on the streets of East New York in the 1950s that included his brothers Gene and Peter, plus his friend Angelo Ruggiero. Angelo's uncle, through his mother, was the future underboss of the Gambino family, Aniello Dellacroce. But in those days, he was just a powerful capo in the Anastasia faction of the family. A lot of the early details about Gotti's criminal career have been lost to time, but it's said that Gotti's small gang ran their own hustles and criminal activities in a territory that belonged to then Anastasia family capo, Carmine Fatico. Their activities got them on Fatico's radar, and they were pegged as possible rising new mafia talent. Dellacroce also probably put in a good word for the boys, and soon they were low-level associates of his crew. The Fatico crew would later be considered blue-collar when compared to the family's labor racketeering and other corrupt activities. They specialized in the traditional mob businesses of gambling and loan sharking, but their main moneymaker was hijacking. JFK Airport was in their territory, and it was one of the busiest logistical hubs in the United States. The hijacking system they set up was efficient and replicable. First, the crew would cultivate an inside man who either worked in a warehouse and knew which truck would have valuable loads, or the driver himself would be their guy. These men would tip off the mobsters, who would then assemble a small crew for the job. If the driver was in on it, he would stop the truck and go along with whatever was needed. If he wasn't, then they needed to somehow ambush the truck, make it stop, and incapacitate the driver for a couple of hours while they did their work. Multiple people were needed to keep a gun on the driver while someone in the crew drove the truck. Trucks were taken to predetermined lots or warehouses where the rest of the crew would unload the cargo. The empty truck would then be abandoned miles away. At this point, moving the goods quickly through a fence was critical, because if the crew was caught with stolen property, then the criminal case against them would be open and shut. While at the warehouse, products might be repackaged to avoid law enforcement scrutiny during a search. For example, cigarette cartons would be removed from their original boxes and placed in a box from a different brand. Electronics would have their serial numbers removed or filed off to make them untraceable. This is called the cleaning process. Now the goods are ready to be fenced, and it's this part of the process that requires some business acumen, the right contacts, and brains, because this is where the money is made. Small wholesalers, small businesses, and secondhand shops would be contacted, and it's these people, the fences, who take over possession of the stolen goods. Usually they would pay the crew about half the retail value of the merchandise. Sometimes larger loads would be divided and sold to different wholesalers across the country to avoid suspicion or clues as to where the goods originally came from. The goods would next make their way to the actual retailers that sold them to the public. Fake invoices would be created to establish a false but plausible paper trail of where the merchandise came from, should anyone look or care. But the loads from the trucks were divided multiple times, and when a shipment finally made it to the store where it was to be sold, it was a small delivery, barely worth noticing. The benefit for the businesses at the end of this chain was that the cost of the stolen items was less than what the real distributor charged, so they decided to look the other way and not ask any questions. A truck carrying $60,000 worth of declared goods would be sold by the hijackers for half that amount. From that $30,000, maybe a third would go to the crew who hijacked the truck and unloaded it. Another third would go to the crew members who facilitated the selling of the stolen goods, and the final third would go to Capo Carmine Fatico, who then kicked up maybe 20% of that to the family's boss. While robbing and unloading a truck might not seem like it takes much skill, Carmine Fatico needed to be very careful about who he brought into this. He kept the crew small and tight to keep operations running smoothly, while also being cautious, because if one of the men turned informant, he could bring the entire operation down and put a lot of guys in prison. For Gotti and his young gang, their early days with the family were spent as gophers. They would run errands for the higher-up guys and drive them around, and from whatever hustles they had going on, they needed to kick a percentage up. But as Fatico began to become more familiar with the young men working for him, John Gotti started to stand out as fearless, ruthless, smart, aggressive, and most importantly, a leader that others willingly followed. By the early 1960s, John had a small arrest record for a few burglaries and had done 6 months in county jail. But by the middle of the decade, Fatico not only had Gotti as part of his hijacking crew, he was allowing him to start managing a few of his own scores. Gotti impressed Fatico so much that he became the older man's heir apparent. It's estimated that Carmine Fatico controlled a crew that contained about 20 soldiers, plus another 100 associates. He could be thought of as a crew boss's boss, given all the people working under him. By the end of the 1960s, John Gotti was the boss of his own crew within the larger Fatico crew. Fatico was Gotti's first mentor, and the lessons he learned from the man would reverberate 20 years later during his time as boss of the Gambino family. The Fatico crew specialized in hijacking, bookmaking, and loan sharking, and in his early days as a mob associate, Gotti learned the intricacies of all these trades. Fatico was a boss who ruled the streets of East New York, and in order to maintain that power, he needed to project fear and reliability. Unlike other earners for the Gambino family, who infiltrated unions and legitimate businesses while gaining fancy titles and climbing the social ladder, Fatico was unapologetic about his role as a street-based mobster. While he might not have been shaking hands with respectable Americans, he had power, and Gotti took notice. Through Fatico, Gotti adopted the philosophy that street credibility was a greater asset than business sophistication when you're in the gangster business. To rule the streets, a boss needed to be accessible, feared, loyal, and most importantly, visible to the neighborhood he lorded over. In 1968, John Gotti hit a bump in his career that he ended up making the most of. Hijackings were becoming a growing problem with cargo leaving JFK, and the FBI increased its surveillance of the area to combat it. Through a stroke of bad luck, agents staking out a parking lot observed John, his brother Gene, and Angelo Ruggiero loading stolen dresses into a U-Haul. They were arrested on the spot. Further investigation into their activities produced multiple witnesses who identified them through mugshot photos as having perpetrated previous robberies. The three men were implicated in 3 cargo heists and 2 carjackings. This was John's first major felony, and he pled guilty. He was sentenced to 3 years at Lewisburg Federal Prison. At Lewisburg, the mobster prisoners all had their own wing, and the man running things there was powerful Bonanno family member Carmine Galante. Gotti impressed the older man so much that Galante expressed interest in bringing him into his own family. He was disappointed to learn that John was already claimed by the Gambinos. Meanwhile, it's believed that Gotti still managed his hijacking crew and the sale of their stolen goods from behind prison walls. By 1972, the makeup of East New York had changed significantly, from predominantly Italian to Black and Puerto Rican. Carmine Fatico decided the neighborhood was no longer to his liking and moved his headquarters to Ozone Park in Queens, which was closer to JFK Airport. He purchased a social club there and named it the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club. The name came from Bergin Street in Brooklyn, where they had previously been based. Fatico had been in charge of East New York since 1951, when Albert Anastasia promoted him to Capo after the Mad Hatter made original family boss Vincent Mangano disappear. But Fatico's mafia career began an involuntary decline that same year he relocated, thanks to charges of loan sharking and criminal conspiracy in Suffolk County. As a condition of his bail, he needed to stay away from known criminals, which meant keeping away from his crew. For his replacement, Fatico asked Carlo Gambino to appoint John Gotti, who had just successfully completed his 3-year sentence. By this point, Gotti was not a made man, but that was through no fault of his own. The books had been closed since 1957, following the Appalachian Conference raid. It could be assumed that Don Carlo, underboss Aniello Dellacroce, and consigliere Joe N. Gallo were all familiar with Gotti, as he was often by Fatico's side. The request was granted, and this mob associate who began as a wannabe kid running errands was now the acting capo. No one can say for certain when John Gotti committed his first murder, but by the time he took over the Fatico crew, it was common knowledge on the streets that he had made his bones. Part of what made Gotti such an effective mafia manager was that he had no qualms about using violence to enforce discipline. His first killing could have been for personal reasons, or it could have been the elimination of a weak link in his network or a rival hijacker encroaching on his territory. More than 50 years later, no one knows for sure, because the Fatico crew handled their own violence and making bodies disappear was a specialty, as was later revealed during the 3 capos' murder. The first confirmed killing that we know John Gotti was involved in was an important stepping stone in his rise through the Gambino family ranks, because this hit came directly from boss Carlo Gambino. In the early 1970s, a small gang was going around New York kidnapping mobsters and releasing them after a ransom was paid. They were lucky not to be murdered in retaliation, but somehow they always managed to stay a step ahead of mob enforcers. Then, in December of 1972, their luck ran out. They kidnapped Carlo Gambino's nephew Manny, who was an associate and a loan shark. After a ransom was paid, Manny was found dead, and Don Carlo wanted revenge. Underboss Aniello Dellacroce connected John Gotti directly to Carlo Gambino. Gotti and Dellacroce had known each other for more than a decade, but after Gotti took over the Fatico crew, they grew closer, as the older man was now John's direct superior. In the spring of 1973, word reached Don Carlo that James McBratney was a member of the gang that had kidnapped his nephew. Investigators don't believe he was involved in Manny's abduction specifically, but he had participated in earlier ones. Either way, a message needed to be sent, and the contract was given to John Gotti. For the acting capo, this was a chance to show that he was willing to kill not just for personal gain, but for the honor of the Gambino family. On May 22, 1973, John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and a third man named Ralph Gallione tracked McBratney to Snoop's Bar and Grill in Staten Island. The HBO Gotti film portrays Gallione as having been placed on the hit by Paul Castellano's order, while other accounts describe him simply as an associate of Gotti's and a soldier in the family. The group approached McBratney, claimed to be detectives, and said he was under arrest. Gallione had the gun, and Angelo had the handcuffs to make the ruse look believable. "You're under arrest and you know the drill. Don't give us any trouble and come outside." McBratney seemed to be cooperating, and then suddenly everything went wrong when another patron intervened and began arguing with the three men. The argument turned physical. Gallione fired 2 shots into the air. McBratney lunged at him and the 2 men fought for the weapon. Gotti and Ruggiero tried to pull them apart, but it was no good. It ended when Gallione shot McBratney 3 times and killed him. Gotti and Ruggiero were identified by witnesses from mugshot photos and went on the lam. Meanwhile, John balanced the management of the Fatico crew with the demands of being a fugitive. He was finally arrested a year later after one of his associates tipped off the FBI. Carlo Gambino hired the expensive and politically connected Roy Cohn to defend Gotti and Ruggiero. The lawyer worked out a deal with the Staten Island district attorney in which both men would plead guilty to attempted manslaughter. They each received a 4-year sentence. Ralph Gallione was not as lucky. He was shot dead outside his apartment building on December 20th, 1973. Whether his death was a coincidence or whether Gotti had him eliminated to sever a connection to the murder will never be known. The case remains unsolved. In 1974, John Gotti found himself in Greenhaven Correctional Facility, about an hour's drive north of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club. His position in the Gambino family was secured. All he needed was for the books to reopen so he could become an official member. Everyone knew that he was a mafia man's mafia man, capable of earning money, enforcing with violence, and managing a complex illegal organization. And while he was behind bars, he continued to impress his superiors. Gotti remained acting capo of the Fatico crew while he was away, and his physical absence from the streets taught him the limits of direct control and the importance of delegating to the right people. His brothers Gene and Peter, plus other crew members like Danny Marino, the Carneglia brothers, Willie Johnson, and others, would pay him visits to report on what was happening and receive his orders on how to respond to problems. Investigators later learned that during this sentence, Gotti was transported to Brooklyn at least 3 times for medical examinations by his private physician. During these visits, he bribed the guards and was allowed to make stops at his home and at restaurants where he was able to meet with other mobsters and conduct business. In 1976, Carlo Gambino passed away from natural causes. Before his death, he named his cousin Paul Castellano, also a powerful capo, as his successor. Castellano came from the white-collar wing of the Gambino family, where most of the money was made through labor racketeering, construction kickbacks, and other corruption schemes that didn't require much violence. That's not to say he was timid. He had no hesitation ordering violence when he felt it was necessary. Aniello Dellacroce had been the family's underboss since 1966, and many of his supporters felt he had been snubbed. Tensions were rising in the family, compounded by the fact that in the weeks after Gambino's death, Dellacroce was in federal prison on a tax evasion charge. When he was released that Thanksgiving weekend, a meeting was held where Dellacroce publicly accepted the results of Don Carlo's wishes. While things were smoothed over for the time being, it was clear that there were 2 factions in the family. Even if Dellacroce was not actively fomenting hostility against Castellano, many members loved and respected him, which caused them to take the slight personally. Gotti felt insulted, but kept it to himself for now. When he was released in 1977, he had been the mobster running that prison's mafia wing. He passed his time there, working out, and by the end of his stretch, he was muscular, weighing 200 pounds at 5 feet 10 inches tall. His younger brother Gene had been running the Fatico crew in John's absence, and while John was away, the books had reopened and Gene had been inducted. Shortly after becoming a free man, John was inducted into the family, with Paul Castellano officiating the ceremony. From that moment, the acting part of his title disappeared, and he was now the official captain of what was renamed the Gotti Crew. Neither man knew it then, but that night had set them on a collision course where only one could survive.
You've just watched part 1 of our 4-part remastered documentary series on the life of John Gotti. And now, here's part 2.
Situated in the exclusive Staten Island section of Toad Hill, with views of New York Bay and the Verrazano Bridge, is the mansion that Paul Castellano built on 1.75 acres in 1980. It was referred to as the White House by members of the Gambino family, an obvious comparison to the home of the President of the United States. The house was a reflection of the wealth and power that Castellano wielded, and it was recently put on the market in 2025 with a listing price of $18 million. Millions of dollars flowed up through the Gambino family's crews into Castellano's pockets, and yet every year the man demanded more from his underlings, which would lead to his sudden downfall in 1985 at the hands of John Gotti. Following his 1977 release from prison, John Gotti returned to his home in Howard Beach, which he shared with his wife Vicky and their 5 children. As a condition of his parole, Gotti needed to have full-time employment, and he found that by working as a salesman for a plumbing supply company owned by his childhood friend Anthony Garino. The salary was good enough for Gotti to purchase TV sets for every room of his house so that his wife could have one wherever she was cleaning, as she distrusted the idea of having an outsider in her home and refused to hire a maid. While the New York State Parole Board was satisfied with how John Gotti's new life was looking, the FBI was not. Knowing who John Gotti was and his involvement with hijackings from JFK Airport, they decided to keep a close eye on him. What they discovered was that he had a no-show job and would spend his days with known criminals, set up in a private office he had established for himself at the Bergin Hunt and Fish Social Club. They also soon learned from sources that Gotti was now the official capo of the crew based there. Following the death of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI's new leadership was restructuring, and organized crime was a major target. But Gotti's early days as a capo coincided with the FBI's learning curve in going after the mob. Cosa Nostra knew that they were being surveilled, so much so that Gotti would sometimes send bottles of wine to Stephen Morrill, the agent assigned to follow him when he was tailed into restaurants. On every occasion, the FBI agent sent them back. Morrill was the first law enforcement official to learn that Gotti had a gambling problem, and he discovered just how bad it actually was through some personal pain. He followed the capo to a horse track and watched him put $8 grand on a race. Thinking the mobster might have had an inside tip, the FBI agent made a smaller bet on the same horse, and it came in dead last. As the official capo of his crew, John Gotti was making more money than ever before. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were flowing into his pockets from over 100 different sources as he oversaw a large crew of 120 soldiers and associates. It was a huge step up from his childhood days when his father struggled to pay the rent on a rundown apartment. But the good times would not last. In March of 1980, Gotti's second youngest son Frank was killed in an accident. He was riding a motorbike and turned onto the road just as a car driven by neighbor John Favara was coming straight. The death was ruled an accident, and both Gotti and his wife were heartbroken. Favara's kids were friends with the Gotti children, and he went to their house to offer his condolences, but Vicky Gotti chased him away with a baseball bat. Favara soon moved away from the neighborhood after receiving death threats and having the word murderer spray-painted on his car. But that was not enough for Gotti. In July of that year, witnesses reported that as Favara walked to his car after work, a man snuck up behind him and clubbed him over the head with a blackjack. He was then shoved into a van and never seen again. Like the people that Gotti might have killed before he became an acting capo, John Favara was never found. And he happened to disappear when the Gottis were in Florida on vacation, so there was no way for police to officially connect this to him either. The case remains unsolved. But every week until he was put away for life, John Gotti would go to the cemetery and pay his dead boy a visit. While he was being watched by the FBI, he was considered to be pretty low on their list of priorities. In relation to the Gambino family's upper leadership, he was mid-level, and outside of his territory, he wasn't that important yet. Just one of many other middle management men. But they were aware of him and watched him when they could. However, NYPD detective and Lieutenant Remo Franceschini took a big interest in the rising Capo regime. He was one of the few mafia experts in the police department, and Queens was also his territory, so for him, Gotti was the biggest gangster in the area, and thus worthy of his intense scrutiny. After receiving multiple tips about Gotti's involvement in gambling and loan sharking, Franceschini, working for the Queens District Attorney's Office, received permission to plant a bug in the social club and to tap 2 phones there. The phone recordings they took did not implicate Gotti in any specific crimes, but it did reveal that the charming man who smiled at his FBI tails while ordering them wine was a brutal tyrant behind closed doors who didn't tolerate any disrespect or incompetence from the men in his orbit. The investigation did take down a gambling ring that was run by Gotti's crew, and it led to a raid of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club. Gotti and his closest men were not arrested and seemed non-bothered by the cops. This got under Franceschini's skin, and he ended up gloating to Gotti about the wiretaps on his phones. Gotti put on a confident face and tried not to seem bothered, so the detective then went on to tell Gotti that they have him on tape making insults about boss Paul Castellano, while also referring to underboss Aniello Dellacroce as the Polak. This nickname referred to Dellacroce looking more Slavic than Italian, and it was forbidden, and this news made Gotti visibly nervous. Another piece of intelligence that the NYPD picked up on the phones was members of Gotti's inner circle, specifically his brother Gene and Angelo Ruggiero, complaining to others about John's degenerate gambling habits. He had an addiction to putting money on losing football teams, and had once also lost 60 grand betting on craps. Naturally, the mobsters were not complaining out of concern for a friend. They were upset because they felt that John's losses were draining the crew's funds, and thus taking money out of their pockets. But for the FBI, their main focus was the Gambino family administration, which was Castellano, Dellacroce, and consigliere Joe N. Gallo. Even among the capos, there were many others that law enforcement considered to be more powerful than John Gotti, like Jimmy Fela, Tommy Gambino, and Patsy Conti. But as they looked closer at Dellacroce, they began to see that he was becoming particularly close with Gotti, taking the younger man in as a protege. So, investigators started to consider that maybe, if they could get something on Gotti, they could use that to get to his direct superior. FBI agent Stephen Morrill now found himself in the position of helping his superiors develop a strategy. Bugging the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club was off the table for now, since the NYPD had just done it, and now the mobsters were on high alert. Gotti's home was also no good, because he never had any meetings there, and the phone records revealed that all of the calls to and from the house were to non-mob members. With Gotti looking almost impossible to get to, they had to look at other members of his inner circle. And they soon zeroed in on Angelo Ruggiero. And what happened next would set the Gambino family on a course that would see its leadership completely change in 4 years. Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti's best friend and partner in crime since boyhood, had seen his mafia career rise along with his friends. While Fat Angelo was the one with the family contact to the upper management, it was John that was promoted to captain. But rather than be resentful of his friend's success, he became his trusted executive officer for running his crew. The FBI began their operation into trying to take down Gotti by chipping away at the men who spent their days working for him. They weren't able to cultivate any of the made soldiers into informants, but a few of the associates whose names we don't have, because it's still redacted, did feed them some information. And they were all handled in a way that meant no one knew who else was talking. This protected them, and it also helped the FBI know that there wasn't any coordination among Gotti's men to feed them misinformation. One tip that came up consistently was that Angelo Ruggiero loved to gossip, so much so that the men called him Quack Quack behind his back. One informant also told the feds that Angelo had bragged about having a foolproof way to avoid federal wiretaps. He had a separate phone line listed under his daughter's name, complete with a pink princess phone that he used exclusively for discussing business. Using these tips, the FBI was able to bug Angelo's house phone and his daughter's separate line, but they didn't get anything incriminating, and shortly afterward, Ruggiero moved his family into a new house, which meant the FBI needed new court orders and had to plant their wiretaps all over again. They also placed a bug in his kitchen dinette after receiving a tip that he liked to talk business there. On the second attempt, they started to yield results. The first piece of gold was Ruggiero discussing boss Paul Castellano. As Gotti's second-in-command, part of his duties included making a trip every Sunday to the boss's Staten Island mansion to deliver that week's tribute. He would then get home, call Gotti to report what had happened, and follow that up with calls to other mobsters to gossip about what Castellano had been saying. This was a windfall for investigators and prosecutors because it gave them probable cause to plant a bug in Castellano's house. The volume of talk about underboss Aniello Dellacroce was enough to justify bugging his home as well. The seeds planted here would later form part of the Mafia commission case in 1986. The conversations Ruggiero was having in 1982, recorded by the FBI in the comfort of his own home, were what set in motion the conflict between Castellano and Gotti that climaxed just before Christmas in 1985. Angelo's brother Salvatore had died in a plane crash just off the coast of Georgia. Salvatore was a heroin smuggler and dealer, and the trip had been a run to bring the drug into the country. This prompted Angelo to partner with Gene Gotti to find his brother's stash and collect millions in profit from a recent drug deal that Salvatore was owed. After having these incriminating conversations, Angelo began to panic that the FBI was watching him. He hired a retired and corrupt detective to sweep his house for bugs. When agents were informed, they switched the devices off. The detective missed the dinette, but told Angelo that the phones were tapped. After he left, the detective was stopped by agents who warned him about the consequences of doing sweep jobs for mobsters. He pleaded that he hadn't actually found anything and had fabricated the comment about the phones in order to justify his fee and get paid. Angelo soon found out that his home had been bugged when a Genovese family member produced a copy of the FBI's court affidavit for the Title III eavesdropping. To this day, no one knows how that document was leaked, but Ruggiero was furious and began making threats against Agent David McCormick, whose name appeared on the document as the authorizing signatory. These threats prompted Bruce Mao, the special agent in charge of the Gambino family investigation, to pay an unannounced visit to Gotti's home with McCormick. Gotti was told that Angelo's threats were unacceptable and that he needed to get his man to stop. Gotti claimed to be unaware of the situation and thanked the agents for bringing it to his attention. A few days later, an informant told the FBI that Dellacroce had personally visited the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club to berate Ruggiero for bringing the feds to John Gotti's door. Things got worse for Ruggiero in 1983 when he was indicted, along with Gene Gotti and 3 other accomplices, for drug trafficking, based on evidence derived from the dinette bug. Making matters worse, the tapes contained hours of him bad-mouthing boss Paul Castellano, calling him a milk drinker and a pansy. What really infuriated Angelo was that Castellano had continued Carlo Gambino's policy banning drug dealing under penalty of death. He found this hypocritical. The boss was more than happy to accept drug profits as tribute while living in his mansion, while the guys on the streets were scrounging just to survive. And if it seemed impossible for Angelo's mouth to get him into any more trouble, he found a way. He was caught on a bug at the Casa Storta restaurant while having dinner with Colombo acting boss Jerry Langella and Capo Donnie Shax Montemarano, bad-mouthing Paul Castellano to them. Speaking ill of your boss to members of another family violated a major unwritten rule of the Mafia. The FBI also learned a great deal about the state of the Gambino family's internal tensions. Angelo informed the Colombos that Castellano was ordering his soldiers to break off contact with the underboss in an attempt to isolate him. The Colombos speculated that the boss was probably working toward having Dellacroce killed, and that Gotti would likely be next after the old man was gone. Indeed, informants told FBI agents that John Gotti appeared afraid of the boss. Whenever he was summoned to meet with Castellano, he would get nervous, knowing there was a chance he might not come back alive. Agents also found out that Gotti made no effort to hide his pleasure when Castellano was arrested and indicted in the commission case. Paul Castellano was facing serious legal problems in 1985 with the upcoming commission trial, but he was still actively working to crush the Dellacroce faction and consolidate his control, while continuing to collect millions in tribute even as he braced for prison. Angelo Ruggiero's drug case, which directly violated his edict, gave him an opportunity to break up the Gotti Crew, which had become a major base of power for Dellacroce. Castellano's plan was straightforward. The FBI had incriminating tapes of Ruggiero, and before his trial, the prosecution would be required to share them with the defense. Ruggiero would then pass copies of the tapes to Castellano, who would make his move. Ruggiero and Gotti knew that the moment Big Paul got those tapes, they were finished. So they did everything they could to stall him. Angelo claimed he didn't want to turn them over because they contained embarrassing information about his family, and that any drug talk was limited to discussions about his late brother. He swore he hadn't dealt drugs himself, but Castellano refused to accept the explanation. By the spring of 1985, Dellacroce, also indicted in the commission case, was dying of terminal cancer and was largely confined to his home. Thanks to Ruggiero's earlier gossip, there was already a bug in place there too, so all conversations between Gotti, Angelo, and the underboss were being recorded. Ruggiero refused to hand over the tapes, and Dellacroce warned him that if he didn't, the tensions could explode into a civil war between the factions that could leave many people hurt or dead. He urged Angelo to surrender the tapes for the sake of peace, but Ruggiero refused, and the meeting ended without a resolution. Gotti had most likely already reached his own private conclusion about what to do next, but he kept it to himself, knowing his mentor would not approve. If Paul Castellano was determined to be an active threat to Gotti and his crew, then he would have to be treated as one. Time was not on Gotti's side either. Dellacroce was dying, and Gotti knew Castellano would move against him the moment his protector was gone. Gotti figured striking first was the only option, but the challenge was doing it in a way that didn't ignite an all-out war. To accomplish this, John needed to develop a skill he rarely called upon in his world of managing violent men. He needed to become diplomatic. The first person he brought into the conspiracy was Angelo Ruggiero, who would also likely be killed if they did nothing. Gotti refused to let any of his brothers in on the plan, reasoning that if he failed and was killed, at least they would still be around to take care of his wife and children. Ruggiero's job was to reach out to men in other crews and gauge who might be willing to join them in killing the boss. Castellano's attention that summer was largely consumed by the upcoming Mafia Commission trial, where wiretaps clearly captured him discussing mob business in his own home. The man was digging in for an expensive legal fight he was sure to lose, while also working to leave behind a substantial nest egg for his own family. All of these extra expenses for the boss meant the lower members were expected to increase their tribute, which rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. One of the first men Ruggiero spoke with was Sammy the Bull Gravano, a hardened killer and prolific earner who was growing increasingly frustrated that no amount of tribute ever seemed to satisfy the boss. Gravano was just a soldier at the time, but he was close to Capo Frank DeCicco, who ran a large crew and was considered part of the Castellano faction. The problem for Big Paul was that DeCicco was also becoming resentful of the constant financial demands. In the Mafia, personal greed has a way of outweighing loyalty to a superior, especially one who wouldn't hesitate to have you killed if it served his interests. Another source of DeCicco's alienation was Castellano's decision to name Tommy Bellotti as his successor should he go to prison. DeCicco felt he was more deserving of that role, and the slight only deepened his disloyalty. In his own mind, of course, it was Big Paul who was being disloyal to the family. The Gotti Crew was not involved in the construction industry rackets, but John soon learned that Castellano had a partnership with the Genovese family that was enriching only him at everyone else's expense. This, too, was seen as a betrayal by many. DeCicco and Gravano were on board, but that wouldn't be enough to prevent a civil war on its own. So Gotti next reached out to Joseph Armone, a long-serving capo in his 60s who, as Gotti correctly anticipated, had grown bitter over never being promoted beyond middle management, and was equally fed up with Castellano's ever-increasing tribute demands. He joined the conspiracy with the expectation that it would be his chance to advance in rank. His role after the murder would be to serve as emissary to the other capos and help prevent a civil war before it could start. The final member of the conspiracy was Robert DiBernardo. He was a soldier without a formal crew who worked directly under Castellano, as he was exceptionally skilled at generating money through construction industry corruption and pornography. Like the others, he felt the boss was taking too large a cut. Because there were 5 of them, the group decided to call themselves the Fist. Mafia rules were clear. A boss could not be murdered without the commission's approval. The Gambino family had a history of working around that requirement. In any case, approaching the commission directly was too dangerous, given the heightened law enforcement surveillance surrounding the upcoming commission trial. Angelo Ruggiero reached out directly to Colombo family acting boss Jerry Langella and was met with enthusiasm. He also contacted members of the Lucchese and Bonanno families, men around his and Gotti's age, to take their temperature. Everyone seemed receptive to the idea. The one family they decided not to approach was the Genovese, as it was considered too risky that word would get back to Big Paul through his partnership with them. In Gotti's mind, he had something equivalent to commission approval, since 4 of the 5 families were on board, counting himself as the representative of the Gambinos. On December 2, 1985, the conspiracy shifted into overdrive when underboss Aniello Dellacroce died. Without the protection of his mentor, and freed from what he knew would have been Neil's disapproval of the plan, Gotti was now free to act, and it needed to happen fast. Big Paul didn't do himself any favors when he decided to skip Dellacroce's wake and funeral. His reasoning was that he couldn't be seen in the company of known criminals given the upcoming commission trial, and that the optics could hurt his legal standing. The decision was widely seen as an insult to the popular underboss and drove a further wedge between him and the rank and file. A week later, Frank DeCicco came to Gotti with word that Castellano was planning an early dinner meeting with several of his trusted capos at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. Now that they knew where the boss would be, Gotti was able to plan an ambush. On Monday, December 16th, Gotti assembled 11 proven killers from his crew for what he described only as a major hit involving 2 targets. He withheld the names of the victims until the last possible hour to prevent word from leaking back to the boss. 4 main shooters would wear identical white trench coats and Russian fur winter hats, making it difficult for witnesses on the crowded street to distinguish one from another. Each man was given a walkie-talkie. The other 7 were positioned near the restaurant entrance and at other points along the street as backup shooters, tasked with making sure no one escaped and both targets were confirmed dead. Gotti and Gravano waited in a parked car down the street with a clear line of sight to where Castellano's car would pull up. As 5 o'clock approached, a car crept past them in traffic with its dome light on. Paul Castellano was in the passenger seat. Gravano got on the walkie-talkie and told the shooters the targets had arrived. The car pulled up in front of the restaurant, and 4 men in Russian fur hats and white trench coats descended on it and opened fire. Castellano was hit 6 times. Bellotti was also shot and killed. The backup shooters were not needed. Everyone fled on foot and got away. Gotti and Gravano pulled into traffic and drove past the fresh crime scene. Gravano looked at Bellotti's body in the street and said he was gone. They then drove off and disappeared into the flow of New York City traffic, leaving the dead boss of the Gambino family bleeding in the street with no hope of being saved.
Thanks for watching so far. Be sure to check out my new Mafia thriller novel, Our Thing, available on Amazon. The link is below in the comments.
On April 27, 1987, less than 2 years after the murder of Paul Castellano, the Gambino family's new boss, John Gotti, was in the process of consolidating his power. He was still operating out of the office he used at the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club when, that afternoon, William Ciccone, a man who has been described as mentally ill, walked past the building and started shooting at the upper floors. Gotti's men chased Ciccone through the streets of Ozone Park, and when they caught him, they started to beat him. A van pulled up, they tossed him inside, and drove away. The next day, his corpse was discovered in the basement of a Staten Island candy shop with 6 bullets in his head. The case remained unsolved until 2009, when an informant identified the killer as Joe the German Watts, a Gambino family associate. After this event, Gotti permanently relocated his headquarters to the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan, the last place he would ever walk into as a free man. According to Sammy the Bull Gravano, the days immediately following the Castellano hit were tense, with the conspirators hiding out and keeping low profiles out of fear that a Castellano loyalist would try to take revenge. During this time, longtime Gambino captain Joe Piney Armone reached out to the other crews in the family to assure them that the violence had been contained to the former boss and his heir apparent. No one else was going to be in danger, so long as they didn't oppose the winds of change. Tommy Bellotti's brother Joe, a soldier in the family, was also in hiding, figuring he might be killed preemptively out of fear that he would one day try to avenge his brother. He was contacted and assured that so long as he posed no active threat to Gotti, he would be welcomed back into the family, and bygones would be bygones. The diplomacy appeared to have worked. On Christmas Eve of 1985, FBI surveillance spotted Gotti at the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan, where the other capos in the family traveled to pay their respects. This had been Aniello Dellacroce's headquarters in Manhattan, and it would soon become Gotti's as well. Joseph N. Gallo was the only remaining member of the Gambino family's pre-December administration. As consigliere, however, he was relatively powerless without any crews to back him up. He was 75 years old and decided to stay on in his role long enough to peacefully transition the organization to its new leadership before retiring. In January, a formal meeting of the capos was held with Gallo presiding. Gotti's name was the only one nominated to be the new leader, and his election was unanimous. He was 46 years old. The murder of Paul Castellano was the first time John Gotti's name appeared in headline news reports. People familiar with the Mafia named him as the one most likely behind the murder. For his part, Gotti always denied it, but everyone knew the truth. Following the murder, Gallo reached out to the other 4 families to inform them that the Gambinos were intact and that they were investigating the murder of their boss to find out who the real killers might have been. Paul Castellano's murder and Aniello Dellacroce's death from cancer were a setback for the government's commission trial. Both men were the only Gambino family members indicted in the case, and within a 2-week period, both were dead. The government was now scrambling to take down the organization's new leader before he could get started. In his early days as boss, Gotti still operated out of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Queens. Almost as soon as he ascended to power, his headquarters was bugged by the New York State Organized Crime Task Force, the Queens District Attorney's Office, and the FBI. Despite knowing that his place had been bugged before, Gotti was still comfortable discussing business freely in his inner sanctum. Almost immediately, there was evidence for a RICO case, with recordings showing that Gotti belonged to and led a criminal organization. He discussed how Gallo was a nice old man, but also rather useless. He wanted to replace him, but wasn't sure who to give the role to. In his own words, his friend Angelo Ruggiero was not bright enough for the job, and he felt that Sammy Gravano was too young to have acquired the necessary wisdom. He was caught on tape appointing Frank DeCicco as his underboss. He was also heard planning to relocate his headquarters to the Ravenite Club in Manhattan to show everyone that symbolically he has moved up in status. Gotti, drawing a lesson from his apprenticeship under Carmine Fatico, believed that as the new boss, he needed to be seen in order for others to appreciate his power. Reflecting his new status, he overhauled his wardrobe with expensive suits and fine clothes, and began appearing at trendy restaurants and nightclubs with his bodyguards. This new boss was not going to hide in the shadows. He wanted the world to know who he was. His arrogance is often cited as the cause of his downfall, but from the very beginning of his reign, various law enforcement agencies were working hard to bring him down. It was widely perceived that the Gambino family had escaped justice when their leaders died rather than stood trial, and more than a few people in government wanted to right that wrong. His first criminal trial stemmed from an incident that occurred when he was still a capo. In 1984, while making his rounds, Gotti double-parked his car and blocked a refrigerator mechanic named Romuald Pisik from driving through the street. The mechanic flew into a road rage, and not knowing who Gotti was, laid on his horn and began to get aggressive. This prompted Gotti and another associate named Frank Coletti to rough the man up, and to add insult to injury, they took more than $300 from his wallet. Still unaware of who Gotti was, and enraged after being beaten and robbed, Pisik went to the police to press charges. Within a few hours, Gotti and Coletti were under arrest. They soon made bail and were back on the streets. Normally, a case like this, where the victim was not seriously hurt, would never make its way through the overburdened court system, but the district attorney saw it as an opportunity to expose the new Gambino boss as a thug, while putting him away long enough to disrupt his operations. In March of 1986, the trial got underway, and Gotti was represented by Bruce Cutler, a former DA turned defense attorney. By now, Pisik knew who Gotti was, and after receiving multiple threats, he was terrified. The entire case rested on his testimony, and when he took the stand and was asked whether it was John Gotti who had attacked him, the visibly shaken man said he no longer remembered who it was and couldn't say for certain. The case fell apart right there, and the judge dismissed it without it ever going to the jury. The following day, the New York Post's headline read, "I for Gotti." This was a defining moment in Gotti's career for two reasons. First, attorney Bruce Cutler had displayed an aggressive courtroom style, attacking prosecutors and witnesses relentlessly, that would be repeated in Gotti's later trials. Second, outside the courthouse, Gotti said nothing to reporters, but seemed to genuinely relish the media attention, smiling and playing up to the cameras. Gotti found himself on trial again later that year in a RICO case being prosecuted by the Eastern District of New York. The case also stemmed from his time before he became boss, and originally he was a minor figure in it, with Aniello Dellacroce as the main target. But with Neil now dead and Gotti now the new boss, the case was reworked to target him. As Gotti prepared for his second trial in the spring of 1986, he began touring his empire, visiting different crews, getting to know their soldiers, and familiarizing himself with their rackets. On one such visit, April 13, 1986, he was scheduled to meet with Frank DeCicco and then visit Capo Jimmy Fela's social club in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Fela was an important earner for the family, controlling their interests in the garbage collection industry, a position he had held since 1957 when Carlo Gambino appointed him to it. Gotti wanted to ensure that money from this lucrative racket continued to flow upward. At the last minute, Gotti canceled his plans and Frank DeCicco went alone. As DeCicco left and started his car, it exploded, killing him instantly. Wiretaps showed that Gotti believed he was the intended target, though he couldn't determine who was behind it. A remote control had been used to detonate the device, and car bombs were unusual for the mob, as they could also kill civilians. Gotti suspected Castellano loyalists, but he could never identify anyone specifically, as he believed everything had been smoothed over since his takeover. The answer would eventually be revealed. The Genovese family was behind it, but for now, Gotti was in the dark. With his underboss dead, he reorganized the family's leadership to compensate. Gallo remained consigliere, but the underboss position would be filled by a ruling panel of 3 capos handling the day-to-day operations of the family: Joe Armone, Angelo Ruggiero, now capo of Gotti's old crew, and Sammy the Bull Gravano, who had taken over Frank DeCicco's crew after his own promotion. The car bombing generated another media sensation, and the judge in the RICO trial responded by postponing proceedings until the frenzy died down. The pre-trial publicity seemed to sharpen Gotti's ease in front of cameras. He would smile and wave, hold doors open for female reporters, and began making brief statements to the press, including the line, "I am the boss of my family, which is my wife and kids." For his second trial, Gotti retained Bruce Cutler again, and this time Cutler turned up his courtroom performance even further. He also worked the press on Gotti's behalf, describing him as a hard-working plumbing salesman unfairly targeted by law enforcement, and declared that if he had a son, he would want that boy to look up to Gotti as a role model. The second trial became an illustration of how various government agencies worked at cross purposes in their competition to be the one to take down the new Gambino boss. Diane Giacalone was the lead prosecutor for the Eastern District, and she wanted the Dapper Don held without bail during the trial so he couldn't intimidate witnesses, a repeat of what had happened in the first case. The judge allowed it, and behind the scenes, the State Organized Crime Task Force pleaded with Giacalone to withdraw the request. They had a wire in Gotti's office that was producing excellent intelligence, and if it continued, they believed they could build an airtight case against him. Giacalone refused. She was determined to win this one. For her, the prosecution was personal. She was from the same neighborhood where Gotti operated. She had spent 6 years building this case, which had begun as an investigation into stick-up crews paying tribute to Gotti for the privilege of working in his territory. Although Dellacroce was originally her main target, after his death, she believed she had adapted the case into an airtight prosecution of John Gotti. Her colleagues in the Justice Department's Organized Crime Strike Force disagreed. Its director, Edward McDonald, went over her head to warn leadership in Washington of his concerns. Their superiors viewed the conflict as 2 prosecutors fighting for the glory of putting Gotti away and sided with Giacalone. Before the trial began, Giacalone found herself in a separate fight with the FBI over a witness. Gotti's boyhood friend and close associate Willie Johnson was a confidential informant, half Italian, half Native American, which meant he could never be inducted into the Mafia. When she learned of him, she placed him on the witness list and intended to expose him in open court. Neither Johnson nor the FBI wanted this, as he was feeding them high-quality intelligence. It was Johnson who had tipped the feds to Angelo Ruggiero's use of his daughter's phone line for mob business. But Giacalone wanted to win, and to her, Johnson was just a criminal, expendable. The trial lasted just over 6 months. While it proceeded, Gotti ran the family through his proxies, as he had done a decade earlier with his crew. Giacalone was a relatively young and inexperienced prosecutor, Cutler was relentlessly aggressive, and the judge was passive. Outside observers in law enforcement couldn't believe what Cutler was being allowed to get away with. He even made personal attacks on Giacalone's character in open court. Even if the trial had gone better for the prosecution, it was doomed from the start. A juror named George Pape saw his jury duty summons as an opportunity rather than an inconvenience, and once selected, he quietly reached out through friends to the right people about his position. Word eventually made its way back to Sammy the Bull, and after some negotiation, Pape agreed to vote not guilty in exchange for $60,000. It was initially assumed that his vote would produce a hung jury, but Pape ended up persuading the other 11 jurors that Giacalone's case was built on personal animosity rather than facts. In the end, John Gotti was found not guilty for the second time. Already dubbed the Dapper Don by the press for his wardrobe, he was now also being called the Teflon Don, since none of the government's charges seemed to stick. Media attention on Gotti intensified, and he reveled in it. He also began to believe that he had beaten his cases because there was something special about him. A conviction reinforced by the fact that, across the East River in Manhattan, the Mafia Commission trial had concluded with each of the bosses and their administrations sentenced to 100 years in prison. John Gotti had climbed from juvenile delinquent to mafia boss in part because of his confidence. But now, that confidence was curdling into full-blown arrogance. He bragged that he was going to lead the next mafia generation in a revolution that would change the way they fought the government, because he knew how to win. And in the spring of 1987, with no pending legal matters to worry about, he was free to enjoy his reign. Gotti began the process of moving his headquarters to the Ravenite Social Club in the Little Italy section of Manhattan. This had been the former headquarters of his mentor, Aniello Dellacroce, and the relocation symbolized two things: his advancement in rank and an enhancement of his prominence, moving up from Queens to Manhattan, the borough the rest of New York simply called the city. Back in the late 1980s, Little Italy was a tight-knit Italian enclave whose residents kept to themselves and were hostile toward outsiders. If police or FBI agents came sniffing around, ordinary residents who had nothing to do with organized crime would still tip off the mobsters. Even if the FBI rented an apartment in the area for surveillance purposes, it would be noticed and talked about. As a result, the government ended up renting apartments a few blocks away in Soho, a neighborhood full of young professionals who didn't talk to their neighbors, and used extreme long-lens cameras to watch the Ravenite and the surrounding streets. That's not to say they never had men in parked cars on Mulberry Street watching the club as well. They did. But those watchers were always spotted, and the mobsters behaved themselves accordingly. It was the team set up a few blocks away that caught them with their guard down. While Gotti wanted no spotlight from law enforcement, he seemed to genuinely enjoy the one the media gave him. He had become a celebrity, appearing regularly in the gossip columns. The lavish wedding he threw for his son John Jr. was a major social event, and his attorney Bruce Cutler was a reliable source of tips for reporters, always feeding them stories about Gotti's acts of generosity. With Gotti in full command of the Gambino family and his recent legal problems behind him, he was ready to rule with a firm hand. Part of his governance included weekly meetings with his capos, who were required to come to the Ravenite and report to the boss every Wednesday or Thursday afternoon. Illegal business, of course, was not discussed inside. That was handled through walk-and-talks. Gotti and his subject would take to the street to discuss anything they didn't want law enforcement to overhear. The walk-and-talks served a secondary purpose as well. They allowed Gotti to be seen on the streets and project his power, a trait he had absorbed from his original mentor, Carmine Fatico. He also enjoyed taunting law enforcement when he spotted them during stakeouts. When the weather was unpleasant, meetings moved to nearby apartments. The FBI did manage to plant a bug in the Ravenite itself, but it didn't yield anything incriminating. Around 1989, growing paranoid about bugs and wiretaps, and increasingly comfortable in his role, Gotti reduced the weekly meetings to once a month. By 1990, that policy changed again, and he began using intermediaries to conduct business, rather than dealing with his people directly. Gotti's administration also underwent changes in the late 1980s, following his acquittal at the second trial. Joe N. Gallo remained consigliere, while Gotti's fellow conspirator from the Castellano murder, Joe Armone, was promoted to fill the vacant underboss position left by Frank DeCicco's death. Part of what had motivated Armone to join the conspiracy in 1985 was his frustration at never being promoted. But now that he had the position, he didn't get to enjoy it for long. In 1986, both Armone and Gallo were indicted on racketeering charges. In December of 1987, both were convicted, and since each was in his 70s, the sentence was effectively a life term. Gallo, who was in poor health, was permitted by the judge to spend one last Christmas with his family. Armone was offered the same opportunity, but in exchange he was required to acknowledge his lifetime of criminal activity before the court. He went to boss Gotti to ask permission, and was denied. Under Gotti's rule, no one was permitted to admit the existence of Cosa Nostra, not associates, soldiers, capos, or underbosses. Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti also stood trial in 1987 on the drug case that had grown out of the taps on Ruggiero's phones. After 2 mistrials, Gene Gotti was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Angelo escaped sentencing because he was dying of cancer, wasting from 250 pounds down to 150 in his final months. Gotti was furious at him for the careless talk that had put his brother behind bars, and never visited his old friend on his deathbed. These developments required the family's administration to be reshuffled. To fill the underboss position, Gotti selected Capo Frank Locascio, viewed as a reliable yes-man who would faithfully execute the boss's wishes. For consigliere, he chose Sammy the Bull Gravano, on whom he had come to rely more and more as he grew increasingly impressed by the younger man. In the summer of 1987, FBI bugs targeting the Genovese family picked up consigliere Louis Manana discussing a possible hit on John Gotti and his brother Gene. The FBI was legally required to inform Gotti, and he thanked them while professing ignorance about why anyone would want him harmed. He was then told it was the West Side, coded language for Greenwich Village, where Genovese boss Vincent Gigante operated. Gotti must have begun to suspect that Gigante was also behind the 1986 car bomb that killed Frank DeCicco. In the autumn of 1988, the first commission meeting in some time was held in the Manhattan apartment of Gambino Capo Frank D'Appolito. 3 of the 5 family bosses attended. The first order of business was for Gotti to declare that he bore no ill will toward the others, and they reciprocated. Gotti then proposed to Gigante and Lucchese family boss Vic Amuso that Vic Orina, the new acting boss of the Colombo family while its leaders were in prison, be given a commission seat. There were no objections. Gotti also proposed readmitting the Bonanno family to the commission, but the matter was left unresolved. Gotti's son, John Jr., was inducted into the family in 1988 and quickly promoted to the rank of capo. To avoid the appearance of nepotism, Gravano performed the ceremony. When Gotti mentioned to Gigante that he had just had his son made, the Genovese boss offered condolences rather than congratulations, saying he would never bring his own children into the Cosa Nostra life. In 1989, Gotti found himself arrested and standing trial with the state of New York as his prosecutor. The charges revolved around a recorded conversation in which Gotti was heard ordering a crime that resulted in an assault. Back in 1986, when Gotti was newly installed as boss and still operating out of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club, where the State Organized Crime Task Force was listening, John F. O'Connor, the leader of a carpenters union local, had gotten wind that a restaurant being fitted out in Battery Park City was using non-union labor. He approached management and offered 2 options: hire his men or pay him a bribe. They told him to go to hell. Shortly afterward, the place was vandalized, causing thousands of dollars in damage. O'Connor was connected to the Genovese family and had no idea the restaurant was secretly owned by Gambino soldier Philip Modica. The matter worked its way up to Gotti, who ordered that it be handled by busting him up. One morning, as O'Connor waited for the elevator to his union offices in Midtown Manhattan, he heard a loud noise followed by sharp pain. He had been shot multiple times in the legs and buttocks. He survived, and investigators believed they had a solid case, Gotti had ordered the man to be busted up, and shortly afterward, he was. The case also hinged on a witness who claimed he could connect Gotti to the shooting. James McElroy was a member of the Irish gang the Westies, and he offered his testimony in exchange for relief from a potential life sentence in another matter. Federal prosecutors felt the case was too weak when the Organized Crime Task Force presented it to them, but the Manhattan District Attorney believed they could make it work. Bruce Cutler was Gotti's attorney again, and he was even more aggressive than before. He painted the case as a glory-seeking exercise by the DA rather than a genuine pursuit of justice, and he dismantled McElroy's credibility as a witness. He even called O'Connor himself to the stand, where O'Connor acknowledged that authorities had never warned him his life was in danger, suggesting the investigators had never taken the threat seriously themselves. Gotti and his co-defendant Anthony Guerrieri were found not guilty on Friday, February 9, 1990. A large victory party was held at the Ravenite. With his third acquittal in 3 years, Gotti was convinced he was untouchable, that no one in law enforcement would risk the embarrassment of going after him again. But the FBI had been watching throughout, and they intended to take their shot. They knew they needed the most airtight case that could possibly be assembled, one built on John Gotti's own voice admitting to his crimes. Their first step was planting additional bugs. One thing they had noticed from the Ravenite recordings was that Gotti's voice would disappear from conversations even when he hadn't been seen leaving the building. This was because there was a back door at the club leading into the building's interior hallways. They placed a bug there and began to get results. One recording captured a hushed conversation between Gotti and Capo Tommy Gambino about labor rackets in the garment district. Another caught a conversation with Bruce Cutler, revealing that in addition to Gotti, he represented other Gambino members in criminal matters, effectively serving as the in-house attorney for the crime family. The centralized management style Gotti imposed on his operations also helped the FBI grasp just how large the Gambino family truly was. Men were coming to see Gotti, whom agents had never identified as capos or connected to organized crime at all. The organization was bigger than they had realized, but thanks to the Teflon Don's habits, they were rapidly filling in the picture. They soon realized the hallway bug wasn't enough. Sometimes, Gotti's voice could be heard moving deeper into the building, fading as he climbed the stairs. Informants told the FBI that he used the apartment of a widow named Nettie Sorelli for private meetings. Her nephew, Norman DuPont, was the caretaker for the Ravenite, and when Gotti wanted to meet privately, he would send the nephew up to tell his aunt to go shopping or visit a friend. Aniello Dellacroce had used the same apartment when he was alive. Sorelli's late husband had been a soldier in the family, so she understood the life and the necessity of these arrangements. Her apartment was almost always occupied, by her or by the mobsters, which made planting a bug extremely difficult. Then the agents caught a break on November 19, 1989, when Sorelli was spotted leaving the building with a suitcase, most likely heading to relatives for Thanksgiving. That night, agents broke into her apartment and planted a bug. For 10 days, the FBI watched Gotti make his nightly visits to the Ravenite, but heard nothing from the Sorelli apartment. They were beginning to doubt the intelligence, but on the night of November 30th, Gotti, Gravano, and Locascio entered the apartment. Locascio turned the radio up to full volume, a standard trick to drown out any recording device, but Gotti told him to turn it down so he could hear better. In that recording, they discussed Paul Castellano, and Gotti's hatred was still raw 4 years after the murder. The investigators were stunned, however, when Gotti claimed not to know who the real killers were and speculated that it might have been the police who did it. On December 12th, Gotti was alone in the apartment with Locascio, and this time the recordings were a prosecutor's dream. Gotti first addressed the murder of Robert DiBernardo. DiBernardo had been part of the conspiracy to kill Castellano, but a year later, Gotti had received word that the man was criticizing him behind his back. Gotti had him killed, but now he was having doubts that the reports had been accurate. They then discussed the murder of Louis de Bono, a soldier in the family who had been in a dispute with Sammy Gravano over the division of profits from a shared construction racket. Gotti was now wondering whether Gravano had fed him false information about De Bono in order to take over the racket entirely. Louis De Bono, you know why he is dying? He's going to die because he refused to come when I called. He didn't do nothing else wrong. Gotti then turned to the murder of Louis Melito. Melito had been a former partner of Gravano's and a member of the Castellano faction who fell out of favor with Gotti and was eliminated during the takeover. Gotti next launched into a broadside against Gravano and all the ways he was spreading into new rackets and businesses. And I tell him a million times, Sammy, slow it down. Pull it in a fucking notch. Slow it down. You come up with 15 companies for Christ's sake. You got rebars, you got concrete pourings, you got Italian floors now. You got construction, you got drywall, you got asbestos, you got rugs. What the fuck next? A recording from January 4th, 1990, revealed that Gotti was anxious about the O'Connor trial. He designated Gravano to serve as acting boss should he go to prison, despite having badmouthed him only weeks earlier.
So I'm asking you, how you feel? You want to sing us good New Year? Or you want me to make you official underboss, acting boss? How do you feel? What makes you feel better?
Gotti also complained about the difficulty of recruiting quality soldiers from the current generation of young men, and grumbled about Bruce Cutler's fees, frustrated that the lawyer felt he was being treated like an errand boy because Gotti expected to be informed of any impending arrest before it happened. A January 24th recording captured Gotti berating himself for being too loose-lipped at the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club. He acknowledged that the wiretap evidence from the O'Connor trial was his own fault. He should have known better. This spiraled into a rant about the need for everyone in the family to stop talking, and a warning that he had better not catch anyone uttering the words Cosa Nostra. The evidence was overwhelming. Now law enforcement had to decide how to use it. After some internal debate, the Federal Eastern District of New York was assigned to prosecute, but Diane Giacalone would not be returning. Her former assistant, John Gleason, was given the role of lead prosecutor, supervised by U.S. Attorney Andrew Maloney. Gleason had established himself as a formidable litigator in the years since the last trial. With a solid RICO case in hand, and knowing from the recordings that Gotti intended to have Gravano run the family in his absence, the FBI decided to arrest the entire Gambino family administration at once. Sensing something significant in the pipeline, Gotti ordered Gravano to go into hiding, and Gravano spent several months laying low in Pennsylvania. Weeks passed without any arrests, and things seemed to have gone quiet from Gotti's perspective. He ordered Gravano back to New York on December 11th for a meeting. In hindsight, they should have chosen somewhere else, but Gotti selected the Ravenite, and the FBI watched as Gotti, Gravano, and Dellacroce assembled in the same place at the same time. Bruce Mao gave the order, and FBI agents swept in to arrest all three men. Roughly 30 other soldiers, capos, and associates were present, but all were allowed to leave. Only Gotti, Gravano, and Dellacroce were led away in handcuffs. Gotti smiled as he was taken out. Dellacroce cursed and shouted. Gravano was stoic, showing neither worry nor anger, though underneath the calm, there was something in his eyes that looked like sadness. In the first half of 1986, Sammy the Bull Gravano went from being a soldier in the Gambino Crime Family to becoming one of its 3 street bosses while John Gotti was being held in jail during his second trial. Angelo Ruggiero would visit Gotti while he was locked up and carry messages between the boss and his men. One of those messages, intended for Gravano, was that Robert DiBernardo, one of the conspirators in the Castellano murder, needed to die. Gravano later claimed that Angelo had manipulated his friend into believing false rumors about DiBernardo because he owed the man $250,000. But Gravano was in no position to refuse the order or to speak with John directly, so he did as he was told. He invited DiBernardo to his office under the pretense of discussing a construction kickback, and as they spoke, another soldier shot the man twice in the back of the head. His body was never found, but years later, thanks to John Gotti's own voice, this murder would come back to haunt them both. While John Gotti was unusual among bosses in his apparent enjoyment of the spotlight, his need for publicity was not what did him in. For many, the theme of his story has been that his flamboyant nature was seen by the government as a taunt, a mockery of their 3 failed attempts to convict him. But the truth is that whoever held the position of Gambino boss was going to be convicted and locked up regardless. Whether it was Paul Castellano or his usurper, the outcome was the same. The federal government had declared the 1980s the decade in which law enforcement would break organized crime. The Castellano hit only delayed that part of the goal until 1992. The day after their arrests at the Ravenite Social Club, Gotti, Gravano, and Frank Locascio appeared in court for their arraignment. 10 days later, during a bail hearing, prosecutor John Gleason argued to the judge that the 3 men should remain locked up, as they posed a danger to the community. He played the tapes of Gotti discussing the murders of Robert DiBernardo, Louis De Bono, and Liborio Melito as evidence of their violent natures. Bail was denied, and they were to remain in custody for the duration of the trial. But the real shock for the men that day was learning that Nettie Sorelli's apartment had been bugged. As the tapes were played, Gravano heard Gotti's voice bad-mouthing him behind his back. Listening carefully, Gravano began to realize that Gotti was shifting blame for the murders onto him, suggesting he had acted alone to resolve personal financial disputes with his partners. Bruce Cutler and his team were also disqualified from representing Gotti, as Cutler appeared on some of the tapes and could therefore be called as a witness. Gotti went on to hire Albert Krieger to represent him. The 3 men were held on the 11th floor of the Federal Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan. With the trial expected to be lengthy, they remained there for months. Gravano fantasized about escaping out the window and rappelling down on a rope, while Gotti dreamed of bribing the president for a pardon. But the longer they were confined together, the more Gravano and Locascio came to resent the boss, who spoke down to them in a demeaning way. Gravano was particularly stung by how Gotti had talked about him on the tapes, despite the fact that he had kicked up millions of dollars to the man. He also believed that Gotti's legal strategy was ultimately to make him the fall guy. "It's not about me now," Gotti had said on tape. "Everything has to be to save Cosa Nostra, which is John Gotti. Cosa Nostra needs John Gotti." Sammy the Bull Gravano felt that John Gotti had betrayed him, and that if he remained loyal, things would only get worse. So he decided to betray John Gotti and the Mafia. He had his wife Deborah pass a message to the FBI that he wanted to cooperate. In October, following a routine court appearance, he was taken out through a back door to meet with agents and discuss what he could offer. Prior to this, the agents had been betting that Locascio would crack before Gravano, but they were grateful for him nonetheless. He was able to connect all the dots in the recordings and explain them plainly to a jury. In exchange for his testimony, he would plead guilty to a reduced RICO count carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years. The alternative was life without parole. Gravano also demanded that his obligation to testify at mafia trials end after 2 years, reasoning that he could then lead a more normal life upon release. While the deal was awaiting approval, Gravano was returned to the jail and acted as though nothing was happening. No one this high up in the mafia had ever turned state's evidence before, and there was concern that this could be a double cross designed to protect Gotti. Eventually, the risk was deemed worth taking, and on the night of November 8th, Gravano was removed from the prison and brought to a motel on Long Island for questioning. The agents were satisfied with his sincerity, and he was then moved to FBI headquarters at Quantico, Virginia for his safety. Gravano was indicted for 3 murders, but confessed to a total of 19 in which he had participated, either as the killer or as the person who set up the victim. The crown jewel of his confession was the full account of the Castellano and Bellotti murders. For 6 years, the government had known Gotti was behind it, but had no way to connect him directly, until now. Gravano also admitted to bribing a juror during Gotti's 1986 RICO trial. Jury selection began in January of 1992, and the judge decided to sequester the jury given the bribery admission. Gotti was defiant, shooting dirty looks at the judge and mouthing insults at the prosecutors. Meanwhile, a crowd of Gotti supporters packed the courthouse and the street outside to show their backing. Gotti and Dellacroce were the only defendants, and in the opening days of the trial, Gotti was forced to sit and listen to his own voice on tape. Prosecutors periodically paused the recordings to show the jury surveillance footage of the Ravenite, establishing when the conversations took place and who else was present. When Gravano was brought in, his testimony stretched over 9 days, punctuated throughout by cold exchanges of looks between the boss and his former right hand. Gotti's comment in the apartment, that the police must have killed Castellano, was explained by Gravano as an inside joke. He assured the jury that Gotti had personally planned the assassination and walked them through it in full detail. The longer Gravano testified, the more visibly unnerved Gotti became. His smile faded and his confidence drained away. When he leaned in to whisper to his lawyers, he appeared angry and frustrated. After Gravano left the stand, the defense called only one witness, a tax attorney who attempted to argue that Gotti was exempt from filing tax returns because he was under investigation for numerous crimes. The argument was dismantled during cross-examination. In closing arguments, Gotti's lawyer contended that the discussions on the tapes were nothing more than idle talk, and that Gravano was the true villain. Dellacroce's lawyer argued that his client had barely spoken during the recorded conversations, and that his mere presence was not sufficient to establish RICO violations. The trial lasted 6 weeks in total, but it took the jury only 14 hours over 2 days to find John Gotti guilty on all counts. Frank Dellacroce was acquitted on the illegal gambling charge, but everything else held. There would be no surprises at sentencing. Federal guidelines mandated that both men spend the rest of their lives in prison without the possibility of parole. Gotti was soon transported to the Marion Federal Penitentiary in southern Illinois. For a man who had once walked the streets to flaunt his power, it was like being sealed in a tomb while still alive. Marion was designed to hold the worst of the worst. His cell was 8 feet by 8 feet, a toilet, a sink, and a concrete slab for a bed with a thin mattress. For entertainment, he was given a small black and white television to help pass the time. The conditions amounted to solitary confinement. His only daily human contact was with the guards who slid a meal tray through a slot 3 times a day. He was allowed 1 hour outdoors in a small yard for exercise, which was restricted to walking. Visits from lawyers or close relatives were permitted, but limited to 2 per month. In 1993, John Gotti the prisoner refused to relinquish his title as boss of the Gambino family. Taking inspiration from Carmine Fatico, he attempted to run the family from behind bars, with his son John Jr. serving as acting boss. His brothers Peter and Richard were both capos in the family and were appointed to a panel to handle the family's day-to-day operations. Junior Gotti had been a capo when his father was arrested, and at the time of his promotion, he was just 28 years old. His tenure was troubled from the start. He lacked the practical experience to run the borgata, and many of the capos resented him, viewing his position as the product of nepotism rather than merit. But John Gotti the father didn't care. He wanted the profits of the crime family flowing to the rest of the Gotti household, even with no real prospect of ever spending the money himself. At first, Gotti held out hope that his conviction might be overturned on appeal on the grounds of inadequate legal counsel, given Bruce Cutler's removal from the case. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit unanimously rejected this argument, and in 1994, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Any remaining hope of walking out of Marion was extinguished. Being boss of the Gambino family meant considerably less inside a federal penitentiary than it did on the streets of New York. One day, while on the exercise yard, Gotti got into an argument with a fellow inmate named Walter Johnson and used a racial slur. The next day, Johnson attacked him and drew blood, not a fatal injury, but a humiliation. Following the incident, Gotti struck an arrangement with the Aryan Brotherhood, the white supremacist prison gang, paying them between $50,000 and $100,000 for protection and for them to kill Johnson. By then, Johnson had already been transferred to another facility, and the contract was never fulfilled. All of Gotti's visits were recorded, but Jr. nonetheless managed to communicate with his father through code words, passing along news and receiving orders in return. A major problem for the family's management was that men were being indicted and imprisoned in large numbers, thanks to the wealth of evidence the FBI had gathered during its surveillance of Gotti at the Ravenite. Jr. was eventually convicted on his own RICO charges and sent to prison in 1999. Gotti then designated his older brother Peter as acting boss. Peter was arrested in 2002 and convicted in 2003. Peter is believed to have maintained influence through a series of acting bosses into the 2000s. In 2011, Domenico Cefalù is believed to have assumed the official leadership of the family. He had been inducted by John Gotti himself in 1990, and unlike his former boss, he maintains an extremely low profile. Most people have no idea who he is. John Gotti's final years were not pleasant. In 1998, he was diagnosed with cancer, and after surgery, his health deteriorated rapidly. His wife, Vicky, stopped visiting after Junior's conviction, blaming her husband for bringing their son into Cosa Nostra instead of protecting him from it. In her eyes, he had ruined their boy. His daughter Victoria continued to come, and Gotti expressed no remorse or regret about the choices he had made in his life, except to tell her that he wished he had never married her mother. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died at the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. It's rumored that $200,000 was spent on his funeral. Gotti had taken over an efficient criminal organization in 1985 that generated millions of dollars annually, and he left it in ruins. In the process, he made his own family very wealthy, and the government has largely been unable to locate that money to seize it. Gotti boasted to his daughter that, "You'll never see another guy like me if you live to be 5,000. He was a unique product of his time, entering the Mafia as an associate during the reign of Albert Anastasia in the 1950s, and ultimately going on to rule that same empire. He once declared that John Gotti was Cosa Nostra, and Cosa Nostra was John Gotti. He was a man who lived the life fully, and while he certainly thrived as a capo in the 1970s, he was not a particularly effective boss. For one, he was not cautious. The same decisiveness that made it possible for him to kill Castellano made him reckless in evading law enforcement surveillance. He was fully aware of wiretaps and bugs, and yet he spoke freely inside his office at the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club, apparently believing it to be immune. He never rotated the locations where he spoke frankly, always falling back on the Sorelli apartment. His insistence that capos come to him at the Ravenite also exposed the organization to FBI observers, effectively handing investigators a roadmap for future prosecutions. Gotti was also a poor judge of character. Sammy the Bull Gravano had a history of killing and betraying partners when it suited him. He had also never served a prison sentence before 1990, and was thus untested when Gotti elevated him to the family's upper ranks. Another man in that position might well have stayed loyal, though it was Gotti's loose talk that put them all in that position to begin with. Gotti's other fundamental flaw was greed. The murder of Paul Castellano could be read as a preemptive act of self-defense, but once he became boss and discovered the scale of wealth available to him, he refused to let it go. He drew his own son into the mob to extend the family's power and income, something fellow boss Vincent Gigante refused to do with his sons out of genuine love for them. Gotti certainly cultivated his public image, and the media attention disgusted his fellow mobsters and enraged law enforcement. But his flamboyance was not what originally put a target on his back. The 1980s and 90s were decades in which organized crime had become a top priority for federal law enforcement to dismantle. When Gotti's assassination of Paul Castellano denied the government its chance to prosecute the Gambino boss as part of the commission trial, he inherited that target simply by becoming the successor. Gotti's reign as a free man lasted 5 years. Given the cumulative weight of his mistakes and law enforcement's relentless determination to put him away, it's remarkable that he lasted that long.